Hey guys, tonight we drift back through the mists of time to witness something extraordinary unfolding in the stone chambers of medieval Europe. You're standing in a drafty castle tower, watching as flickering candlelight dances across the face of a noble woman who's about to discover that her kitchen holds the keys to eternal youth. The year is 1147, and you can smell the yeast from yesterday's bread mixing with the sweet scent of wildflower honey as Lady Matilda of Normandy stares at her reflection in a polished silver mirror, tracing the fine lines that have begun to appear around her eyes like tiny tributaries of time itself. You watch as she reaches for a crust of day-old bread, and something magical is about to happen that will echo through centuries of beauty rituals. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for about why your grandmother always insisted that honey was nature's miracle cure, or why certain beauty treatments seem to have existed forever without anyone remembering their origins. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to share where and when you started watching tonight, or perhaps tell me about your own family's ancient beauty secrets that have been passed down through generations. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported to an era when beauty wasn't about Instagram filters or department store cosmetics, but about survival, status, and the desperate human desire to hold back the relentless march of time. In these medieval chambers, you witness the birth of something profound. The moment when necessity birthed innovation, and kitchen scraps became the foundation of an empire built on vanity and hope. The castle around you creaks with the weight of centuries, its stones having absorbed the whispered secrets of countless women who understood that their appearance was their currency, their power, and sometimes their only path to survival. You observe Lady Matilda as she begins her morning ritual, unaware that she's about to stumble upon techniques that will influence beauty practices for the next 1,000 years. As you watch, you realize this isn't just about cosmetics. It's about the ingenious ways humans have always adapted their environment to serve their deepest psychological needs. The medieval world was harsh, unforgiving, and brutally honest about the connection between beauty and survival. Yet here, in these intimate moments before dawn, you're witnessing the tender vulnerability of women who refuse to surrender to time without a fight. You notice how Lady Matilda's movements are deliberate, almost ritualistic, as she begins to combine ingredients that her grandmother whispered about on her deathbed. The bread crumbs she's collecting aren't just food waste. They're the beginning of a beauty revolution that will spread across Europe like wildfire, carried by marriage alliances, trade routes, and the universal feminine desire to remain forever young. The honey she reaches for next gleams like liquid gold in the candlelight, imported at great expense from lands where monks have perfected the art of beekeeping. Each drop represents not just sweetness, but the collective wisdom of ancient civilizations who understood that nature held answers to questions they hadn't even learned to ask yet. You sense the anticipation in the air as Lady Matilda prepares to mix her first face mask, completely unaware that she's about to become part of a story that connects Cleopatra's milk baths to modern skincare laboratories, proving that human vanity might just be humanity's most enduring and resourceful trait. You follow Lady Matilda's delicate fingers as they tear apart yesterday's bread, the crust crackling softly in the pre-dawn silence. This isn't mindless destruction. You're witnessing the birth of Europe's first systematic anti-aging treatment, born from the practical wisdom that nothing in a medieval household could afford to go to waste. The bread she's handling tells its own story of survival and innovation, baked in monastery ovens where monks discovered that certain grains possessed almost magical properties when combined with other ingredients. You watch as she pours deep red wine over the breadcrumbs, the liquid soaking into the grain with a gentle hiss that sounds almost alive in the quiet chamber. This wine isn't just any vintage. It's been blessed by Benedictine monks who understood that fermentation created compounds that could soften even the most weathered skin. The monastery of Saint-Denis, just outside Paris, has become legendary for producing wines that noble women across Europe specifically request for their beauty rituals, though few understand the scientific principles that make this combination so effective. As the bread absorbs the wine, you notice how it transforms into something entirely new, a paste that releases the subtle scent of fermented grapes mixed with yeast. Lady Matilda has learned this technique from her aunt, who discovered it during a diplomatic visit to the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, where French sophistication was beginning to revolutionize European beauty standards. The bread mask represents more than cosmetics. It's a symbol of cultural exchange and the gradual refinement of medieval society. You observe how carefully she selects each piece of bread, avoiding anything too fresh or too stale. The perfect bread for this treatment must be exactly 1 day old, when the moisture has partially evaporated, but the grain structure remains intact enough to hold the wine without completely dissolving. This knowledge has been passed down through generations of women who understood that timing in beauty treatments was as crucial as timing in cooking or farming. The wine she uses comes from vineyards that have been cultivating grapes since Roman times, their deep roots drawing minerals from soil that has been enriched by centuries of fallen leaves and organic matter. You can almost taste the complexity in the air, notes of oak, earth, and something indefinably ancient that speaks to the continuity of human cultivation and the desire to transform simple ingredients into something miraculous. Historians still argue whether the bread mask tradition originated in French monasteries or evolved from ancient Roman grain-based cosmetics, but you're watching living proof that innovation often emerges from the intersection of necessity and creativity. Lady Matilde doesn't care about historical precedent. She only knows that her grandmother's skin remained remarkably smooth well into her 60s, and that this bread mixture was her most closely guarded secret. You notice how she mashes the wine-soaked bread with a wooden spoon carved from apple wood, a detail that matters more than it might seem. Apple wood contains natural acids that enhance the fermentation process, creating a slightly acidic environment that helps exfoliate dead skin cells while delivering nutrients deep into the pores. The medieval understanding of such chemical interactions was intuitive rather than scientific, but their results often rivaled modern cosmetic achievements. As the mixture reaches the perfect consistency, smooth enough to spread but textured enough to provide gentle abrasion, you realize you're witnessing the moment when beauty treatment became an art form rather than mere hygiene. Lady Matilda's movements have taken on the precision of a craftsperson, each stir calculated to achieve maximum effectiveness, while maintaining the delicate balance that separates beneficial treatment from skin irritation. The transformation happening in her hands represents humanity's eternal optimism, the belief that we can improve upon nature, that time's effect can be slowed or reversed, and that beauty is worth pursuing even in an age when survival consumes most of daily energy. You're watching hope being literally mixed by hand, one careful motion at a time. You find yourself following ancient trade routes that stretch like golden threads across continents, connecting the sun-baked apiaries of Egypt to the stone towers where Lady Matilda now reaches for her most precious ingredient. The honey she's about to use has travelled thousands of miles, passed through dozens of hands, and survived pirates, sandstorms, and political upheavals to reach this moment in her castle chamber. Each amber drop contains the concentrated essence of Mediterranean wildflowers, carrying within it the accumulated wisdom of Egyptian queens who understood that honey held secrets more valuable than gold. You watch as she breaks open a clay pot sealed with beeswax, releasing an aroma so rich and complex it seems to transform the very air around her. This isn't the processed honey you might find in modern stores. It's raw, unfiltered nectar that still contains traces of pollen, royal jelly, and the subtle mineral content of the ancient soils where those flowers grew. The merchant who sold this treasure to Lady Matilda's household described it as liquid starlight, and watching it pour from the vessel, you understand why such poetic language felt necessary. The Egyptian connection runs deeper than mere commerce, you realise, as Lady Matilda begins mixing honey with crushed pearls that shimmer like captured moonlight. Cleopatra herself used similar combinations, though her recipes included ingredients so exotic they read like magical incantations. Ground lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, frankincense from the Horn of Africa, and honey from sacred groves where priestesses tended bees considered to be messengers of the gods. The pearl powder Lady Matilda uses comes from oysters harvested in the North Sea, their calcium carbonate providing gentle exfoliation, while the honey's natural enzymes work to dissolve dead skin cells. You observe the almost ritualistic precision with which she measures each ingredient, understanding instinctively that the ratio between honey and pearls must be perfect to avoid either ineffectiveness or painful abrasion. The knowledge she's applying has been refined through generations of trial and error, each medieval lady building upon the discoveries of her predecessors in an unbroken chain of experimentation that stretches back to antiquity. The honey she's using represents more than just a beauty ingredient. It's a miracle of natural chemistry that modern science has only recently begun to fully understand. You watch as she stirs the mixture, unknowingly activating enzymes that will provide gentle chemical exfoliation, while antibacterial properties prevent infection and promote healing. Medieval women didn't understand terms like alpha-hydroxy acids or natural humectants, but they recognized results when they saw them. As the honey and pearls blend into a lustrous paste, you're reminded that this represents one of humanity's earliest examples of international beauty commerce. The trade routes that brought this honey to Norman castles also carried silk from China, spices from India, and cosmetic knowledge from cultures that have been perfecting these arts for millennia. Lady Matilda's morning beauty routine is actually a testament to medieval Europe's growing connection to the wider world. Historians still argue whether the honey-pearl combination originated in Byzantine Constantinople or evolved independently in multiple courts, but the evidence suggests that beauty knowledge flowed along the same paths as other precious commodities. You're witnessing a moment when local innovation meets global tradition, creating something entirely new from the synthesis of ancient wisdom. The pearl dust catches the candlelight as Lady Matilda continues mixing, each particle reflecting light in ways that will later create an ethereal glow on her skin. These pearls have their own story, formed over years in the cold waters off the Scottish coast, harvested by divers who risked their lives for these calcium treasures that noble women valued more than silver coins. You notice how the honey's consistency changes as it warms in her hands, becoming more fluid and easier to work with while releasing volatile compounds that create the intoxicating floral scent filling the chamber. This transformation isn't accidental. Medieval beauty practitioners understood that temperature affected the effectiveness of their treatments, though they explain these phenomena through theories of bodily humours rather than molecular chemistry. The mixture in her hands represents the convergence of multiple civilizations' beauty wisdom, proof that human vanity has always been a powerful force for cultural exchange and technological innovation. You find yourself standing on the windswept cliffs of Dover, watching as workers chip away at the brilliant white chalk face that has protected England for centuries. These same cliffs that will one day symbolize British defiance are now providing the raw material for Lady Matilda's most transformative beauty secret. The chalk being harvested here possesses unique properties, formed over millions of years from compressed marine organisms. It contains microscopic fossils and minerals that create the perfect base for medieval face powder. You follow the chalk as it makes its journey from cliff face to castle chamber, transported in leather sacks on the backs of sure-footed ponies that navigate the treacherous coastal paths. The workers who extract this precious white powder understand that not all chalk is created equal. The layers closest to the surface have been weathered by salt air and contain impurities, while the deeper veins yield the pure, fine-grained material that noble women prize above all other cosmetic ingredients. Back in Lady Matilda's chamber, you watch as she grinds the chalk with a marble pestle, reducing the chunks to an impossibly fine powder that feels like silk between her fingers. This process requires patience and skill. Too much pressure creates gritty particles that will scratch delicate skin, while too little fails to achieve the ethereal fineness necessary for a flawless application. The grinding stone she uses has been in her family for generations, its surface worn smooth by countless beauty preparations. You observe the transformation as she begins mixing the chalk powder with rose water, distilled from petals gathered at dawn when their essential oils are most concentrated. The combination creates a paste with an almost otherworldly luminescence, capable of covering imperfections while reflecting light in ways that make skin appear to glow from within. This isn't merely about hiding flaws. It's about creating an illusion of perfection that borders on the supernatural. The chalk she's using represents millions of years of geological history compressed into a beauty treatment, each particle containing the fossilized remains of ancient sea creatures that lived when England was covered by tropical oceans. You can almost sense the deep time embedded in this simple white powder, connecting Lady Matilda's morning routine to epochs that stretch beyond human comprehension. Medieval understanding of chalk's properties was remarkably sophisticated, even if their explanations relied on theories about sympathetic magic rather than chemistry. They recognized that Dover chalk absorbed moisture without leaving residue, provided gentle exfoliation without irritation, and created a base that made other pigments appear more vibrant. You watch as Lady Matilda tests the mixture's consistency on the back of her hand, adjusting the proportions with the expertise of someone who has spent years perfecting this particular formula. Historians still argue whether the use of chalk in cosmetics originated with Celtic druids, who considered white cliffs sacred, or developed independently as Roman practices merged with Anglo-Saxon traditions. What's certain is that by the 12th century, English chalk had gained a reputation across Europe as the finest base for noble cosmetics, leading to a thriving export trade that enriched coastal communities for generations. You notice how the chalk mixture changes colour slightly as it dries, shifting from pure white to a subtle cream that will complement Lady Matilda's natural skin tone. This isn't accidental. Experienced practitioners understand that chalk interacts with the natural oils and pH levels of individual skin types, creating personalized results that no mass-produced cosmetic could achieve. The grinding process releases a faint mineral scent that mingles with the rosewater, creating an olfactory signature that will cling to Lady Matilda's skin throughout the day. In a world where personal hygiene is inconsistent and pleasant scents are luxury items, this subtle fragrance serves multiple purposes, masking less pleasant odours while signalling wealth and refinement to anyone who comes close enough to detect it. As she works the chalk into the perfect consistency, you realise you're witnessing the birth of an industry that will eventually span continents and generate enormous wealth. The humble white cliffs of Dover are providing the foundation for European cosmetics manufacturing, though the workers extracting this treasure have no idea their labour will influence beauty standards for centuries to come. You step through the heavy wooden doors of the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where the morning air carries the mingled scents of incense, parchment, and something entirely unexpected. The herbal laboratory where Brother Anselm documents beauty recipes with the same meticulous precision he applies to illuminated manuscripts. These monastery walls dedicated to prayer and contemplation have become unlikely centres of cosmetic innovation, where learned monks apply their knowledge of botany, chemistry, and human anatomy to the pursuit of earthly beauty. You watch as Brother Anselm carefully records Lady Matilda's bread mask formula in his leather-bound journal, his quill scratching across vellum as he translates her intuitive knowledge into the formal Latin that will preserve these secrets for future generations. His cramped handwriting documents not just ingredients and proportions, but detailed observations about seasonal variations in effectiveness, the influence of moon phases on preparation timing, and the subtle differences between recipes that work for different skin types and ages. The monastery's herb garden sprawls before you like a living pharmacy, each plot carefully tended by monks who understand that God's creation holds remedies for every human ailment, including the vanity that drives women to seek eternal youth. You observe Brother Benedict as he harvests chamomile flowers at precisely the moment when their essential oils reach peak concentration, his movements guided by knowledge that combines spiritual devotion with practical expertise accumulated over decades of experimentation. These monastic beauty laboratories represent an extraordinary convergence of religious dedication and worldly knowledge, you realize, as you explore rooms filled with distillation apparatus, grinding stones, and carefully labelled jars containing ingredients from across the known world. The monks don't see any contradiction between serving God and helping noble ladies maintain their earthly beauty. They view their work as exploring the divine wisdom embedded in nature's pharmacy. You discover manuscripts that read like magical grimoires but are actually sophisticated treatises on cosmetic preparation, complete with detailed illustrations showing proper mixing techniques, optimal storage methods, and warnings about dangerous combinations that could burn or poison delicate skin. Brother Anselm's notes reveal a deep understanding of what modern science would call pH balance, chemical interactions, and dermatological sensitivity, though he explains these phenomena through medieval theories about the balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry humours. The monastery's connection to noble courts creates a fascinating network of knowledge exchange, you observe, watching as Lady Constance of Brittany arrives for her monthly consultation with Brother Anselm. She brings samples of new ingredients discovered by her husband's traders, while he provides refined formulations based on the latest developments in monastic laboratories across Europe. This collaboration between secular vanity and religious learning produces innovations that neither could achieve alone, Historians still argue whether these monastic beauty practices evolved from ancient Roman medical traditions preserved in monastery libraries, or developed independently through systematic experimentation with local plants and minerals. The evidence suggests both influences contributed to a uniquely medieval approach that combined empirical observation with theoretical frameworks derived from classical texts and Christian theology. You examine the abbey's still room, where monks distill essential oils and prepare tinctures using techniques that won't be improved upon for centuries. The copper apparatus gleams in the filtered sunlight streaming through narrow windows, each piece of equipment designed for maximum efficiency in extracting the active compounds from plants, flowers, and exotic ingredients imported through the monastery's extensive trade connections. The beauty recipes emerging from these religious laboratories possess a sophistication that challenges modern assumptions about medieval ignorance. You realize, reading over Brother Anselm's shoulder as he calculates the precise proportions of honey, wine, and crushed pearls needed to create Lady Matilde's facial treatment. His formulation accounts for seasonal variations in honey composition, the alcohol content of different wines, and the calcium carbonate density of pearls from various geographic sources. These monk scholars understand that effective cosmetics require the same precision and attention to detail as any other craft, whether illuminating manuscripts or brewing medicinal tonics. Their systematic approach to beauty preparation establishes principles that will guide cosmetic development for centuries, proving that vanity, properly channeled, can drive genuine scientific advancement. You watch as Brother Anselm carefully seals his latest formula in a wax-stoppered vial, knowing that this seemingly simple beauty treatment represents the accumulated wisdom of multiple civilizations, filtered through medieval scholarship and refined by monastic discipline into something approaching perfection. You follow Marguerite to the nursery the next morning, where small voices create a symphony of domestic life that she orchestrates with the precision of a master conductor. Here, surrounded by wooden toys and children's laughter, she prepares to deploy perhaps her most powerful weapon in the battle for Geoffrey's attention. The strategic involvement of their offspring in creating emotional bonds that make leaving home feel like abandoning not just a wife, but an entire future legacy. You watch as she carefully times Geoffrey's entry into the children's daily routines, ensuring he witnesses moments of pure paternal pride that will anchor his heart more securely than any chain. This morning, their 6-year-old son William has been coached to demonstrate his new reading skills precisely when his father appears for breakfast, creating a spontaneous moment of fatherly achievement that Marguerite has actually orchestrated with military precision. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that medieval fathers typically maintained distant relationships with their children, leaving child rearing entirely to wives and nurses until sons reached an age for military or scholarly training. But what you're observing reveals how clever wives subverted this tradition, creating opportunities for emotional connection that transform distant patriarchs into devoted family men. Here's the psychologically brilliant detail that shows the true sophistication of medieval feminine strategy. Wives learn to present their children as extensions of their husband's greatness, rather than as competing demands for attention. You watch Marguerite point out how William has inherited Geoffrey's strong jaw, how their daughter Mathilde displays her father's quick wit, how even the baby's determined crying reminds everyone of Geoffrey's powerful voice when he commands his men. You observe her staging what appears to be a spontaneous family moment, William proudly showing his father a wooden sword he's carved, Mathilde reciting a poem she's learned, the baby reaching chubby arms toward Geoffrey with perfectly timed smiles. But none of this is actually spontaneous. Marguerite has spent weeks preparing these performances, understanding that men respond more strongly to their children's achievements when they feel personally responsible for inspiring them. The medieval wife's nursery becomes a theatre where fatherhood is presented as Geoffrey's most important and rewarding role. You notice that Marguerite never frames child-related activities as burdensome duties, but always as opportunities for Geoffrey to witness and guide the development of his future legacy. When William struggles with his letters, she suggests that his father's patient instruction would be more valuable than any tutor's teaching, but the real genius lies in her understanding of masculine psychology and the male need to feel important and irreplaceable. You watch as she creates situations where the children specifically request their father's attention, not because they need help, but because they want to share their accomplishments with him. She's programmed them to seek Geoffrey's approval and presence, making him feel uniquely valuable to their development. Historians still argue whether medieval mothers deliberately used their children as tools of marital manipulation, or whether these practices developed naturally from the practical needs of family life. But the systematic nature of Marguerite's approach suggests conscious strategy rather than accidental outcome. You observe her most subtle technique as she shares carefully selected stories about the children's daily activities, highlighting moments that demonstrate their need for paternal guidance and their pride in their father's achievements. When Geoffrey hears that William told the stable boys that his father is the strongest knight in the region, or that Matilda refused to eat until she could wait for Papa to return from his duties, he experiences the deep satisfaction of feeling genuinely needed and appreciated. The medieval wife's child management strategy extends far beyond basic care. She's creating a family dynamic where Geoffrey's presence enhances everyone's happiness, and his absence creates noticeable emotional gaps. You watch as the children perform their practiced enthusiasm when he enters rooms, their choreographed disappointment when he mentions possible travels, their strategic requests for bedtime stories that only Papa can tell properly. Perhaps most cleverly, you notice that Marguerite frames Geoffrey's relationship with their children as uniquely special and irreplaceable. She points out personality traits and talents that the children have inherited specifically from him, making him feel genetically and emotionally connected to their future success. When William shows aptitude for strategy games, she credits Geoffrey's mental sharpness. When Mathilde displays musical talent, she reminds him of his own singing voice during their courtship. You watch as she creates what modern psychologists would call positive reinforcement loops around Geoffrey's paternal involvement. Every moment he spends with the children produces tangible evidence of their development and happiness, making fatherhood feel like his most successful and meaningful achievement. She's essentially programming him to derive his primary sense of accomplishment from domestic rather than external pursuits. The evening routine becomes a masterpiece of emotional manipulation disguised as family tradition. You observe the children's carefully orchestrated request for Papa to tell stories, to check for monsters under beds, to provide goodnight kisses that apparently only he can deliver with the proper protective magic. These aren't authentic childhood needs. They're learned behaviours that make Geoffrey feel indispensable to his family's security and happiness. As you watch Geoffrey surrounded by adoring children who hang on his every word and clearly prefer his company to anyone else's, you realise you've witnessed something profound. Marguerite has transformed parenthood from a biological fact into an emotional addiction, making Geoffrey crave the unique satisfaction of being these particular children's irreplaceable father and protector. You accompany Marguerite to the castle's chapel the following dawn, where stone arches frame an altar that she approaches not just as a place of worship, but as the ultimate theatre for deploying spiritual guilt and religious obligation in service of domestic retention. Here, surrounded by flickering votive candles and carved saints who seem to watch with knowing eyes, she prepares to weaponize Geoffrey's immortal soul against his wandering impulses. You watch as she kneels in prayer with theatrical devotion, timing her spiritual exercises precisely to coincide with Geoffrey's morning routine. When he enters to fulfill his own religious obligations, he finds her already deep in communion with the divine, creating the visual impression of a wife whose piety surpasses his own, a subtle challenge to his spiritual leadership that will gnaw at his masculine pride until he feels compelled to match or exceed her devotional efforts. The mainstream historical fact that every student learns is that medieval society was thoroughly saturated with Christian doctrine, and religious observance formed the backbone of daily life for nobles and peasants alike. But what you're witnessing goes far beyond simple devotion. This is the strategic deployment of spiritual authority to create moral obligations that bind Geoffrey more securely to home than any physical chain ever could. Here's the deliciously manipulative detail that would make medieval priests simultaneously proud and horrified. Wives learn to frame their husbands' domestic responsibilities as sacred duties ordained by God himself. You listen as Marguerite whispers prayers that Geoffrey can overhear, asking divine blessing for my husband's faithful stewardship of the family God has entrusted to his care, and seeking heavenly guidance for his wise decision to place duty to home above worldly adventures. Lens, you observe her consulting religious text with the dedication of a scholar, but she's not simply seeking spiritual enlightenment. She's memorizing scripture passages that support her domestic agenda, biblical verses about the sanctity of marriage, the importance of fathers to their children, the spiritual dangers of abandoning one's divinely appointed responsibilities. She's essentially building a theological arsenal designed to make Geoffrey's wandering impulses feel like sins against God rather than mere personal preferences. The medieval wife's prayer book becomes a strategic manual for spiritual manipulation. You notice that Marguerite has carefully marked passages about faithful husbands who found divine favour through devotion to their families, and cautionary tales of men who lost God's protection by neglecting their domestic duties. When Geoffrey asks about her reading, she shares these selections with innocent enthusiasm, allowing scripture itself to deliver messages she couldn't express directly. But the real psychological brilliance lies in her understanding of medieval masculine spirituality and the knight's code that demanded protection of the innocent and vulnerable. You watch as she frames herself and their children as souls entrusted to Geoffrey's spiritual guardianship, making his presence at home not just emotionally satisfying but religiously mandatory. Historians still argue whether medieval wives consciously manipulated religious doctrine for domestic purposes, or whether their piety genuinely aligned with their marital goals, but the systematic nature of Marguerite's approach suggests sophisticated theological strategy rather than simple faith. You observe her most subtle technique as she establishes religious routines that require Geoffrey's participation and leadership, family prayers that need his masculine authority, blessing rituals that demand his presence, spiritual discussions that position him as the household's religious guide and moral instructor. She's created a system where his absence compromises not just family happiness, but their collective spiritual welfare. The medieval wife's religious calendar becomes a strategic tool for domestic retention. You notice that Margaret emphasizes feast days and holy observances that celebrate family unity and domestic virtue, while downplaying religious festivals that might encourage travel or external activities. She's essentially editing the liturgical year to support her domestic agenda, making home-based worship feel more spiritually significant than public religious gatherings. Perhaps most cleverly, you watch as she introduces the concept of spiritual accountability into their marriage. She suggests that God will hold Geoffrey responsible, not just for his own soul's welfare, but for the spiritual development of his wife and children. Every decision to leave home becomes a choice that potentially endangers the eternal salvation of those dependent on his guidance and protection. You observe the morning prayer session where Marguerite guides the family in asking divine blessing for Geoffrey's wisdom in choosing God's will over worldly temptations. The children innocently echo her words, creating a chorus of spiritual pressure that makes his potential departures feel like betrayals of both family and faith. She's programmed even their prayers to reinforce domestic obligations. The medieval wife's confessional strategy extends beyond personal piety. She creates situations where Geoffrey must examine his own spiritual priorities and find them wanting if they don't prioritize family above adventure. You watch as she shares concerns for his soul's welfare that she's discussed with their priest, making his wandering impulses feel like spiritual weaknesses that require religious correction. The final masterstroke comes as you observe her establishing what she calls their family covenant with God, a private spiritual commitment that frames their marriage and Geoffrey's presence at home as sacred obligations that transcend personal desire. She's essentially made leaving home feel like breaking a promise to the Almighty himself, turning domestic retention into a matter of eternal consequence. As Geoffrey kneels beside her in prayer, visibly moved by the spiritual weight of his family responsibilities and clearly reconsidering the hunting expedition he'd planned for next week, you realize you've witnessed something remarkable. Marguerite has transformed religious devotion into domestic devotion, making Geoffrey's soul's salvation dependent on his faithfulness to hearth and home. You follow Marguerite to Geoffrey's private study the next afternoon, where ledgers and account books create a landscape of numbers that she navigates with the precision of a master strategist. Here, surrounded by records of income and expenditure that represent the financial bloodstream of their household, she prepares to deploy perhaps her most sophisticated weapon, the subtle manipulation of economic control that will make Geoffrey's domestic presence not just emotionally satisfying, but financially essential. You watch as she reviews the household accounts with Geoffrey, ostensibly seeking his guidance on routine expenditures, but actually demonstrating her indispensable role in managing the complex economic machinery that sustains their lifestyle. Every question she asks about grain purchases or servant wages reinforces the reality that his wealth flows through her hands, making her continued cooperation essential to his financial stability and social status. The mainstream historical fact that most people understand is that medieval wives had limited legal rights to property ownership, with most assets technically belonging to their husbands under the doctrine of coverture. But what you're observing reveals how clever wives subverted these legal restrictions through practical economic control, making themselves so financially indispensable that their husbands couldn't afford to alienate or abandon them. Here's the brilliantly calculated detail that shows the true sophistication of medieval feminine economic strategy. Wives learned to position themselves as the essential bridge between their husband's wealth and its practical application. You watch as Marguerite demonstrates her intimate knowledge of market prices, seasonal variations in commodity costs, and the complex web of credit relationships that keeps their household functioning smoothly. You observe her discussing the upcoming wool sales with Geoffrey, but she's not simply reporting business information. She's subtly highlighting her personal relationships with merchants, her reputation for honest dealing, her knowledge of market conditions that makes her presence essential to maximizing their profits. She's essentially making herself the irreplaceable component in their economic success, the human element that cannot be delegated or replaced. The medieval wife's account book becomes a weapon of domestic retention disguised as household management. You notice that Marguerite has carefully documented every financial improvement that resulted from her personal involvement, the better prices she negotiated through charm and persistence, the costly mistakes prevented by her careful attention to detail, the profitable opportunities discovered through her social networks and market intelligence. But the real genius lies in her understanding of masculine psychology and the male need to feel successful and prosperous. You watch as she presents their financial information in ways that make Geoffrey feel like a brilliant economic strategist, while simultaneously demonstrating that his success depends entirely on her continued cooperation and expertise. She's stroking his ego while tightening her economic grip. Historians still argue whether medieval wives' financial involvement represented genuine partnership or manipulative control, but the systematic nature of Marguerite's approach suggests conscious strategy designed to make her husband economically dependent on her domestic presence. You observe her most subtle technique as she discusses potential investments and business opportunities, always framing her advice in terms of protecting and enhancing Geoffrey's wealth and reputation. When she suggests avoiding a particular merchant because of rumours about his honesty, or recommends investing in additional farmland because of rising grain prices, she positions herself as his most valuable economic advisor. The medieval wife's financial intelligence network extends far beyond simple bookkeeping. She cultivates relationships with merchants, craftsmen, and other wives that provide insider knowledge about market conditions, business opportunities, and economic threats. You watch as she shares information that Geoffrey couldn't possibly obtain through his male social networks, making her feminine connections essential to their financial security. Perhaps most cleverly, you notice that Marguerite manages their money in ways that make Geoffrey's presence at home financially rewarding, while making his absences economically costly. When he's home to make decisions and provide his seal for important transactions, their business dealings prosper. When he travels, opportunities are missed and problems arise that require expensive solutions. You watch as she creates what modern economists would recognize as opportunity costs around Geoffrey's potential departures. The grain merchant who will only deal directly with the lord of the manor, the important business meeting that requires both husband and wife to present a united front, the seasonal timing that makes his presence essential for maximizing agricultural profits. The medieval wife's spending patterns become strategic tools for domestic retention. You observe that Marguerite times major purchases and household improvements to coincide with periods when Geoffrey might be contemplating travel, creating financial obligations that make departure impractical, new livestock that requires his oversight, building projects that need his supervision, investments that demand his continued attention and authorization. The final layer of her economic strategy involves what you might call financial emotional conditioning. You notice that their most profitable and satisfying business successes occur when Geoffrey is fully engaged in domestic management, while their costliest mistakes and missed opportunities happen when his attention wanders toward external pursuits. She's programming his subconscious to associate domestic focus with financial prosperity. As you watch Geoffrey poring over account books with genuine interest and obvious pride in their household's economic success, you realize that Marguerite has accomplished something remarkable. She's made their marriage feel like the most profitable partnership he could possibly maintain, transforming domestic retention from emotional manipulation into sound financial strategy. The evening concludes with Geoffrey praising Marguerite's business acumen and expressing gratitude for her careful stewardship of their wealth, never suspecting that her greatest business achievement has been making herself economically indispensable to the man whose wandering impulses might otherwise threaten their domestic stability. You accompany Marguerite to the Solar, where she hosts her weekly gathering of neighbouring wives. But this isn't merely a social occasion. You're witnessing the careful construction of a strategic alliance network designed to create social obligations that will anchor Geoffrey more firmly to their domestic community. Here, surrounded by the gentle murmur of feminine conversation and the soft rustle of embroidery silk, she orchestrates what amounts to a medieval public relations campaign focused on making her husband's local reputation dependent on his continued presence at home. You watch as she guides the conversation with the skill of a master diplomat, ensuring that each visiting wife leaves with specific information about Geoffrey's wisdom, generosity, and essential role in the community's well-being. This isn't accidental gossip. It's calculated reputation management designed to create social pressure that makes his departure feel like abandoning important community responsibilities rather than pursuing personal adventure. The mainstream historical fact that everyone learns is that medieval society operated through complex webs of mutual obligation and social reciprocity, with noble families maintaining their status through careful attention to community relationships and public reputation. But what you're observing goes far deeper. The deliberate construction of social bonds so intricate and valuable that breaking them would damage Geoffrey's standing in ways that might take years to repair. Here's the deliciously manipulative detail that reveals the true sophistication of medieval feminine networking. Wives learn to position their husbands as indispensable figures in other families' domestic stability, creating situations where Geoffrey's absence would disappoint not just Marguerite, but an entire network of people who had come to depend on his counsel, protection, and leadership. You observe her discussing the upcoming harvest festival with Lady Catherine from the neighbouring manor, but she's not simply planning entertainment. She's strategically volunteering Geoffrey for essential organising roles that will make the community's celebration depend on his presence and active participation. By the time the conversation ends, he'll be morally obligated to remain home for an event that affects dozens of families. The medieval wife's social calendar becomes a weapon of domestic retention, disguised as community service. You notice that Marguerite schedules important social obligations with careful attention to timing, ensuring that Geoffrey's potential travel plans always conflict with events where his absence would be noticed, discussed, and potentially criticised by other families. But the real psychological brilliance lies in her understanding of masculine honour and the medieval knight's deep need to maintain his reputation for reliability and service to others. You watch as she creates situations where leaving home would force Geoffrey to break promises to people whose good opinion he values, making his wandering impulses feel like betrayals of his knightly code rather than simple personal choices. Historians still argue whether medieval wives consciously manipulated social networks for domestic purposes, or whether these community connections developed naturally from the practical needs of manor life. But the systematic nature of Marguerite's approach suggests deliberate strategy rather than accidental outcome. You observe her most subtle technique as she shares carefully selected information about other husbands who have abandoned their domestic responsibilities, always framing these stories as cautionary tales about men who lost community respect through selfish choices. She's programming the social consciousness of her female network to view male wandering as morally questionable behaviour that reflects poorly on a man's character. The medieval wife's reputation management extends beyond simple gossip. She cultivates an image of Geoffrey as uniquely wise, reliable, and essential to community well-being. You watch as she arranges for other wives to seek his advice on their own domestic problems, creating a network of people who view him as their personal counselor and problem solver. Perhaps most cleverly, you notice that Margaret frames Geoffrey's presence at home as a blessing that benefits the entire community rather than just their own family. When he helps resolve disputes between neighbours, when he provides security advice to other manor lords, when he shares his military expertise with younger knights, she ensures that these contributions are widely known and deeply appreciated. You watch as she creates what modern sociologists would recognise as social capital around Geoffrey's domestic engagement. His reputation for being a devoted husband and father becomes part of his public identity, making any departure from these roles feel like a betrayal of community expectations rather than a personal choice. The medieval wife's alliance network becomes a sophisticated intelligence gathering and influence distribution system. You observe that the other wives share information about their own husband's activities and intentions, creating a feminine communication network that gives Marguerite advance warning of potential threats to her domestic stability. Upcoming military campaigns, hunting expeditions, or business ventures that might tempt Geoffrey away from home. The final master stroke comes as you watch her establish what amounts to mutual domestic insurance among the wives. They agree to support each other's efforts to keep their husbands engaged in community life, creating a network of feminine cooperation that makes every wife more effective at domestic retention. When one husband shows signs of restlessness, the others rally to create social obligations and community needs that require his presence. As the gathering concludes with the other wives praising Geoffrey's wisdom and expressing their gratitude for his continued guidance and protection, you realize you've witnessed something remarkable. Marguerite has transformed their marriage from a private arrangement into a public institution, making Geoffrey's domestic faithfulness essential to his social standing and community leadership. The evening ends with Geoffrey receiving multiple invitations to advise on community matters, arbitrate local disputes, and participate in social celebrations, all carefully orchestrated by Marguerite's network to ensure that his calendar remains full of local obligations that make travel impractical and departure socially costly. You settle beside the great hearth with Margaret as evening shadows dance across the stone walls. But this isn't simply a moment of domestic tranquility. You're about to witness the deployment of perhaps her most sophisticated weapon in the arsenal of wifely retention. Here, in the flickering candlelight that transforms the hall into an intimate theatre, she prepares to weave stories that will capture Geoffrey's imagination so completely that no external adventure could possibly compete with the entertainment she provides within their own walls. You watch as she arranges herself in the storyteller's chair with the practiced grace of a master performer, understanding that positioning, timing, and atmosphere all contribute to the hypnotic power she's about to unleash. Geoffrey enters seeking simple evening companionship, but he's about to encounter narrative magic designed to make him crave her voice above all other entertainment, her imagination above all other diversions. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that medieval entertainment relied heavily on oral tradition, with travelling minstrels and court storytellers providing the primary source of narrative pleasure for noble households. But what you're witnessing goes far beyond simple entertainment. This is psychological programming through story, the strategic deployment of narrative to shape Geoffrey's understanding of heroism, adventure, and the true meaning of a meaningful life. Here's the brilliantly manipulative detail that shows the true artistry of medieval feminine storytelling. Wives learn to craft tales that appear to celebrate masculine adventure and external achievement, while actually reinforcing the superiority of domestic virtues and home-based satisfaction. You listen as Margaret begins a story about a knight who discovered that his greatest victory lay not in distant battlefields, but in the quiet courage required to build and protect a loving family. You observe her voice modulating with the skill of a trained performer, dropping to intimate whispers during romantic passages, rising to dramatic crescendos during action sequences, but always returning to warm conversational tones that create the impression of personal sharing rather than formal entertainment. She's not just telling stories, she's creating an addictive auditory experience that Geoffrey will find impossible to replicate anywhere else. The medieval wife's story repertoire becomes a carefully curated collection of narratives designed to influence her husband's values and aspirations. You notice that Marguerite's tales consistently feature heroes who find their greatest fulfillment through devotion to family, villains who abandon domestic responsibility for selfish pursuits, and moral lessons that frame home as the ultimate destination for any truly noble quest. But the real psychological genius lies in her understanding of masculine ego and the male need to see himself reflected in heroic narratives. You watch as she subtly incorporates details from Geoffrey's own life and achievements into her fictional heroes, making him unconsciously identify with characters who choose domestic faithfulness over external adventure. She's essentially programming his self-image through story, making him aspire to be the kind of man her tales celebrate. Historians still argue whether medieval storytelling served primarily as entertainment or as a vehicle for moral instruction, but the deliberate nature of Marguerite's narrative choices suggests conscious strategy designed to shape Geoffrey's understanding of heroism and masculine virtue. You observe her most subtle technique as she introduces stories within stories, creating narrative layers that hold Geoffrey's attention for hours, while delivering multiple messages about the rewards of domestic commitment and the dangers of abandoning family responsibilities. Her tales feature brave knights who almost lose everything through wandering, wise kings who discover that ruling their own households requires greater skill than commanding armies, and heroes whose greatest adventures unfold within the walls of their own homes. The medieval wife's storytelling session becomes an immersive experience that rivals any external entertainment Geoffrey might seek elsewhere. You notice that Marguerite incorporates interactive elements, asking for his opinion about character motivations, requesting his military expertise to evaluate battle strategies described in her tales, making him a collaborative participant rather than a passive audience. Perhaps most cleverly, you watch as she creates ongoing narrative series that end each evening on compelling cliffhangers, ensuring that Geoffrey will return tomorrow night eager to discover what happens next. She's essentially turning domestic storytelling into serial entertainment that creates anticipation and guarantees his continued presence at home. No tavern storyteller can compete with personalized, customized narratives specifically designed to appeal to his interests and reinforce his domestic commitments. You observe the evening's climax as Margaret tells a story about a lord who thought he needed to seek adventure abroad to prove his worth, only to discover that protecting his family from a mysterious threat required more courage and skill than any external quest could provide. The tale features detailed descriptions of domestic strategy, family loyalty, and the quiet heroism of daily devotion that makes Geoffrey see his own life through new eyes. The medieval wife's narrative strategy extends beyond individual stories. She creates thematic cycles that reinforce consistent messages about masculine virtue and the true nature of heroic achievement. You notice that her winter tales emphasize the wisdom of staying close to hearth and home, while her spring stories celebrate the adventures that can be found within familiar territories and loving relationships. As Geoffrey sits entranced by a particularly engaging tale about a knight who discovered that his wife's wisdom surpassed any counsel he could receive from external advisors, you realize you've witnessed something remarkable. Marguerite has transformed storytelling from simple entertainment into sophisticated psychological programming, making her voice and imagination essential to Geoffrey's evening satisfaction and emotional contentment. The session concludes with Geoffrey eagerly anticipating tomorrow night's continuation of an unfinished tale, his imagination already captured by narrative possibilities that exist only within the domestic sphere she controls so masterfully. You accompany Marguerite to the castle's chapel as she prepares for the celebration of St. Bridget's feast day. But this isn't merely religious observance. You're witnessing the strategic creation of intimate family traditions designed to make their domestic calendar more compelling than any external seasonal celebrations or courtly festivities. Here, surrounded by evergreen boughs and flickering candles that transform the stone sanctuary into something magical and uniquely theirs, she orchestrates private rituals that will anchor Geoffrey's emotional calendar to home rather than to the wider world's distractions. You watch as she involves their children in preparing special decorations that exist nowhere else in the region, creating visual traditions so distinctively beautiful and personally meaningful that Geoffrey will find other celebrations pale and unsatisfying by comparison. These aren't random holiday activities. They're calculated emotional programming designed to make their family's private celebrations feel more significant and rewarding than any public festival he might attend elsewhere. The mainstream historical fact that everyone understands is that medieval society revolved around the religious calendar, with major feasts and holy days providing the primary structure for seasonal celebration and community gathering. But what you're observing goes far deeper. The deliberate creation of personalized ceremonial traditions that make their family's private observances more emotionally satisfying than participation in broader social celebrations. Here's the psychologically brilliant detail that reveals the true sophistication of Marguerite's domestic strategy. She learned to identify the specific elements of public celebrations that Geoffrey found most appealing, then create enhanced private versions that delivered the same emotional satisfaction, while requiring his presence at home rather than his departure for external festivities. You observe her preparing what she calls their memory feast, a special meal that incorporates dishes representing each significant moment in their family's history, from their wedding banquet to the children's christening celebrations. This isn't simple nostalgia, it's strategic emotional anchoring that makes Geoffrey experience their shared past as a tangible presence at their table, reinforcing the accumulated value of their domestic life together. The medieval wife's ceremonial calendar becomes a weapon of domestic retention disguised as family tradition. You notice that Marguerite has carefully timed their private celebrations to conflict with external events that might tempt Geoffrey away from home, creating emotional obligations that make his presence feel essential to the family's spiritual and emotional well-being. But the real genius lies in her understanding of masculine psychology and the male need to feel like a leader and creator of meaningful experiences. You watch as she positions Geoffrey as the essential architect of their family traditions, asking for his input on ceremonial details and making him feel personally responsible for creating the magical experiences that bring their children such obvious joy and satisfaction. Historians still argue whether medieval family traditions developed organically from religious requirements or were consciously designed by wives to strengthen domestic bonds. But the systematic nature of Margaret's approach suggests deliberate emotional architecture rather than accidental custom. You observe her most subtle technique as she creates what she calls anticipation rituals, preparations for upcoming celebrations that begin weeks in advance and require Geoffrey's continued participation to reach their satisfying conclusions. The special ale that must ferment for exactly 28 days, the carved decorations that need his skilled hands to complete, the family stories that require his voice to tell properly during the feast itself. The medieval wife's celebration planning extends beyond single events. She creates seasonal cycles that make Geoffrey's presence feel essential to the proper ordering of time itself. You watch as she establishes spring planting blessings that require his strength, summer harvest celebrations that need his leadership, autumn preservation rituals that depend on his protection, and winter storytelling traditions that showcase his wisdom and experience. Perhaps most cleverly, you notice that Margaret frames their private celebrations as unique family privileges that other households cannot access or replicate. Their children grow up understanding that the magical experiences they enjoy at home represent something special and exclusive, making them unconscious advocates for domestic life who reinforce Geoffrey's sense that staying home provides superior experiences to anything available elsewhere. You watch as she creates what modern psychologists would recognize as positive emotional conditioning around specific dates and seasons, ensuring that Geoffrey's happiest memories become associated with domestic celebrations rather than external adventures. Every important anniversary, every seasonal transition, every family milestone becomes an opportunity to reinforce the emotional rewards of home-centered life. The evening celebration unfolds like a perfectly orchestrated performance, where Geoffrey plays the starring role as family patriarch and celebration leader. You observe how Marguerite has designed every element to make him feel essential, appreciated, and genuinely needed, not as an audience member, but as the central figure whose presence transforms ordinary domestic activities into meaningful ceremonial experiences. The medieval wife's tradition creation strategy involves what you might call emotional time travel, ceremonies that simultaneously honor their past achievements, celebrate their present happiness, and create anticipation for future family milestones. You notice that each celebration includes elements that require planning for next year's observance, ensuring that Geoffrey's emotional calendar extends far into the future with domestic obligations and anticipated pleasures. As the evening concludes with Geoffrey clearly moved by the warmth and meaning of their private celebration, surrounded by children who obviously view him as the essential element that makes their family traditions magical and complete, you realize you've witnessed something remarkable. Marguerite has transformed the passage of time itself into a series of domestic anchors that make staying home feel like participating in sacred rituals that exist nowhere else in the world. The night ends with the family already planning modifications and additions for next year's celebration, making Geoffrey an active architect of future domestic pleasures that will require his continued presence to achieve their full emotional impact. You follow Marguerite to her private herb garden as dawn breaks across the castle grounds. But this isn't simply morning maintenance of medicinal plants. You're about to witness the deployment of healing knowledge that makes her indispensable to Geoffrey's physical comfort and well-being. Here, among rows of carefully tended chamomile, feverfew, and willow bark, she cultivates not just therapeutic remedies, but the kind of personalized medical care that transforms her from wife into irreplaceable healer, whose absence could literally threaten his health and survival. You watch as she selects herbs with the precision of a master physician, understanding that Jeffrey's body has become accustomed to her specific treatments and remedies in ways that make other healers seem inadequate and unreliable by comparison. This morning's preparation isn't random herbalism. It's strategic medical dependency creation designed to make Jeffrey's physical comfort and health contingent on her continued presence and care. The mainstream historical fact that everyone learns is that medieval wives served as their family's primary medical practitioners, possessing extensive knowledge of herbal remedies, wound care, and treatment of common ailments in an era when professional physicians were rare and expensive. But what you're observing goes far beyond simple healthcare. This is the deliberate cultivation of medical indispensability that makes Jeffrey's physical well-being dependent on domestic stability. Here's the brilliantly calculated detail that shows the true sophistication of Marguerite's healing strategy. She has learned to identify and treat Jeffrey's specific physical vulnerabilities and chronic discomforts with such precision that her remedies provide relief that no other healer can match. His recurring back pain from years of wearing heavy armor, his seasonal congestion that strikes every autumn, his digestive troubles that flare during periods of stress. She has developed personalized treatments that make her medical knowledge uniquely valuable to his daily comfort. You observe her preparing what she calls Jeffrey's morning restoration, a carefully calibrated blend of herbs that addresses his specific physical needs while creating a pleasant daily ritual that makes starting each day without her care feel incomplete and unsatisfying. The bitter willow bark for his joint stiffness, the soothing mint for his often troubled stomach, the energizing rosemary that sharpens his mental clarity for the day's responsibilities. The medieval wife's healing practice becomes a weapon of domestic retention disguised as loving care. You notice that Marguerite has documented Jeffrey's physical responses to different treatments with the precision of a natural scientist, creating a personalized medical profile that allows her to anticipate and prevent health problems before they become serious enough to require outside intervention. But the real psychological genius lies in her understanding of masculine pride and the male reluctance to admit vulnerability or dependence. You watch as she frames her medical treatments not as evidence of Jeffrey's weakness, but as maintenance of his strength and enhancement of his natural capabilities. Her remedies don't treat illness. They optimize performance, prevent problems, and maintain the physical condition necessary for his demanding responsibilities as lord and protector. Historians still argue whether medieval wives' medical knowledge represented genuine therapeutic skill or simply traditional folk remedies of questionable effectiveness. But the systematic nature of Margaret's approach and Jeffrey's obvious physical improvement under her care suggests sophisticated understanding of practical medicine. You observe her most subtle technique as she creates healing rituals that provide not just physical relief, but emotional comfort and intimate connection. The evening foot massage with aromatic oils that soothes his tired muscles, while creating opportunities for quiet conversation, the herbal steam treatments that clear his breathing while requiring her gentle attendance, the medicinal baths that ease his aches while providing private time for marital intimacy. The medieval wife's medical repertoire extends beyond treating existing problems. She specializes in preventive care that keeps Jeffrey healthy enough to avoid the need for external medical consultation. You watch as she prepares strengthening tonics for seasonal transitions, protective remedies for times when disease threatens the region, and nutritional supplements that maintain his energy and vigor throughout the demanding cycles of medieval life. Perhaps most cleverly, You notice that Marguerite has made Geoffrey's optimal health contingent on her specific knowledge and continued care. His body has adapted to her treatments, his physical comfort depends on her remedies, his seasonal health patterns have become synchronized with her preventive interventions. Any extended absence from her care would result in genuine physical discomfort that would make travel or external adventures genuinely unpleasant experiences. You watch as she creates what modern doctors would recognize as integrated wellness care, medical treatment that addresses not just physical symptoms, but emotional and psychological well-being. Her evening herbal teas don't just aid digestion, they contain mild sedatives that promote restful sleep and pleasant dreams. Her morning remedies don't just prevent illness, they include stimulants that enhance mood and mental sharpness throughout the day. The medieval wife's healing touch becomes a daily necessity rather than an occasional luxury. You observe that Geoffrey has come to depend on her skilled massage techniques for relief from the physical stresses of his demanding lifestyle. Her knowledge of pressure points that ease tension, her gentle hands that can identify and treat minor injuries before they become serious problems. The morning routine concludes with Geoffrey clearly experiencing the physical comfort and renewed energy that Margaret's treatments provide, his body responding to remedies so perfectly calibrated to his individual needs that seeking medical care elsewhere would feel like a significant downgrade in quality and effectiveness. You realize you've witnessed the creation of medical dependency disguised as loving care. Geoffrey needs Marguerite's healing knowledge not just for comfort, but for optimal physical functioning in his demanding role as medieval lord and protector. As she packages additional remedies for him to carry throughout the day, you understand that she's made his physical well-being contingent on remaining within reach of her medical expertise and healing touch. You slip silently behind the heavy tapestry that separates the main hall from Marguerite and Geoffrey's private chamber as evening settles over the castle. But this isn't mere domestic voyeurism. You're about to witness the most intimate theatre of medieval marriage, where words become weapons and touch transforms into diplomatic negotiation. Here, in the flickering candlelight that casts dancing shadows across their marriage bed, Marguerite prepares to deploy the ultimate arsenal of feminine persuasion through the delicate art of pillow talk and bedroom politics. You observe her arranging herself with the calculated precision of a master strategist, preparing for the most important negotiation of her day. Every gesture, every positioning of limbs and fabric, every modulation of voice and breath has been practiced until it appears completely natural, but you recognize the sophisticated performance of a woman who understands that the bedroom represents her most powerful sphere of influence over Geoffrey's decisions and future plans. The mainstream historical fact that everyone learns about medieval marriage is that wives were expected to submit to their husband's authority in all matters, with bedroom interactions governed by religious doctrine that emphasized duty over pleasure. But what you're witnessing reveals how clever wives subverted these expectations, transforming intimate moments into opportunities for subtle control and strategic influence that shaped their husbands' choices far more effectively than any direct confrontation ever could. Here's this scandalously sophisticated detail that would shock medieval moralists. Wives learned to time their most important requests and suggestions to coincide with moments when their husbands were most physically and emotionally vulnerable, using post-intimate conversations to plant ideas and influence decisions when male psychological defenses were at their lowest and most receptive. You watch as Marguerite initiates what appears to be casual pillow talk, but every topic she introduces has been carefully selected to reinforce themes of domestic satisfaction and family responsibility. Her gentle questions about Geoffrey's day aren't simple interest. They're strategic intelligence gathering designed to identify his current concerns and emotional states, so she can tailor her influence accordingly. The medieval wife's bedroom becomes a diplomatic chamber where the most important household decisions are actually made through intimate negotiation rather than formal discussion. You notice that Marguerite never directly challenges Geoffrey's authority or explicitly states her preferences. Instead, she plants seeds of doubt about external adventures and cultivates enthusiasm for domestic projects through subtle suggestion and emotional manipulation. But the real psychological genius lies in her understanding of masculine post-intimate vulnerability and the male need to feel like a protector and provider for those who depend on his strength and wisdom. You observe her expressing carefully calibrated concerns about potential dangers he might face if he travels, worries about family security during his absence, and gentle reminders of how much his presence means to those who love him most. Historians still argue whether bedroom conversations between medieval spouses represented genuine emotional intimacy or calculated manipulation, but the systematic nature of Marguerite's approach suggests conscious strategy designed to influence Geoffrey's decision-making through his most emotionally receptive moments. You watch her most subtle technique as she uses physical affection and intimate touch to reinforce verbal messages, creating positive emotional associations with ideas she wants Geoffrey to embrace, while subtly withdrawing warmth when he mentions plans that conflict with her domestic agenda. She's essentially conditioning his emotional responses through carefully timed physical rewards and subtle emotional distance. The medieval wife's intimate influence extends beyond single conversations. She creates patterns of bedroom discussion that consistently reinforce messages about the rewards of domestic focus and the costs of external distraction. You observe that their most satisfying intimate moments are always followed by conversations that celebrate their partnership, their family's happiness, and the unique pleasures of their private world together. Perhaps most cleverly, you notice that Marguerite uses intimate moments to create what modern psychologists would call emotional bonding experiences that make Geoffrey associate his deepest satisfaction and contentment with her presence and their shared domestic life. She's programming his subconscious to crave not just physical intimacy, but the emotional environment that makes such intimacy possible and meaningful. You observe the evening's most crucial moment as Marguerite shares her fears about losing Geoffrey to some external adventure, framing her concerns not as controlling demands, but as expressions of love so deep that the thought of separation causes her genuine distress. She's essentially making his potential departures feel like betrayals of their intimate bond rather than reasonable personal choices. The medieval wife's bedroom diplomacy involves what you might call emotional legislative sessions, where important family decisions are actually made through intimate discussion rather than formal household management. You watch as Geoffrey finds himself agreeing to delay travel plans, modify business ventures, and prioritize domestic obligations in response to conversations that feel like loving sharing rather than calculated influence. The night's intimate negotiations conclude with Geoffrey clearly feeling more emotionally connected to Marguerite and more committed to their shared domestic life, never suspecting that his renewed dedication to home and family resulted from psychological manipulation rather than spontaneous affection. You realize you've witnessed the bedroom transformed into a laboratory of marital influence, where physical intimacy becomes the vehicle for profound psychological control. As you withdraw from your hidden observation post, you understand that the marriage bed represents Marguerite's ultimate weapon in the campaign for Geoffrey's domestic retention. The place where his defences are lowest, his emotions most accessible, and his decision-making most susceptible to feminine influence, disguised as loving devotion. You accompany Margaret to her writing desk in the solar as morning light streams through the narrow windows, illuminating parchment and quill that represent far more than simple correspondence. You're about to witness the strategic deployment of written communication that transforms mere letters into emotional lifelines, designed to keep Geoffrey psychologically tethered to home, even when physical distance threatens their domestic bond. Here, surrounded by carefully preserved love notes and thoughtfully composed messages, she prepares to wage psychological warfare through the written word. You watch as she selects the finest parchment for today's letter, understanding that the physical quality of her correspondence communicates messages about value and importance that reinforce the emotional content of her words. This isn't casual note writing. It's calculated literary seduction, designed to make Geoffrey's thoughts return obsessively to home and wife regardless of whatever external distractions compete for his attention. The mainstream historical fact that most students learn is that literacy among medieval women was relatively rare, with letter writing primarily confined to noble households and religious communities where education was available, and correspondence served practical administrative purposes. But what you're observing goes far beyond simple communication. This is psychological manipulation through written intimacy that creates emotional dependencies stronger than any physical chain. Here's the brilliantly manipulative detail that reveals the true sophistication of medieval feminine correspondence. Literate wives learned to craft letters that appeared to provide information and support, while actually creating emotional hunger for continued communication and domestic reunion. You observe Marguerite composing messages that leave Geoffrey feeling simultaneously satisfied by her attention and desperately eager for more intimate contact that only personal presence can provide. You notice her beginning with what she calls memory anchoring, specific references to shared experiences that trigger positive emotional associations with their domestic life together. The morning Geoffrey praised her honey cakes, the evening they watched their son take his first steps, the private joke that made them both laugh during last week's dinner with visiting neighbours. She's essentially programming his memory to focus on moments that reinforce the emotional rewards of home. The medieval wife's correspondence becomes a weapon of domestic retention, disguised as loving support. You watch as Marguerite carefully balances expressions of independence and capability with subtle reminders of how much she values Geoffrey's presence and guidance, making him feel simultaneously confident about leaving her temporarily and eager to return to resume his essential role in her happiness. But the real psychological genius lies in her understanding of masculine ego and the male need to feel needed and appreciated by those who matter most. You observe her describing minor household challenges that require his wisdom to resolve properly, small decisions that await his superior judgment, and family matters that benefit from his unique perspective and experience. Historians still argue whether medieval correspondence between spouses represented genuine emotional intimacy or strategic manipulation designed to maintain marital bonds across physical separation. But the systematic nature of Marguerite's letter writing suggests conscious psychological strategy rather than simple affectionate communication. You watch her most subtle technique as she includes what she calls anticipation details, specific descriptions of preparations she's making for Geoffrey's return that create mental images of domestic pleasure and comfort awaiting him at home. The special meal she's planning for his arrival, the household improvements that will surprise and delight him, the intimate moments she's anticipating when they're reunited. The medieval wife's gift-giving strategy extends beyond simple presents to carefully selected tokens that carry deep personal meaning and create lasting emotional connections. You observe Marguerite preparing a small wooden carving that Geoffrey whittled for their first anniversary, polished to renewed beauty and wrapped with a note explaining how it reminded her of his skilled hands and patient craftsmanship during their early years together. Perhaps most cleverly, you notice that her letters create what modern psychologists would call emotional scheduling, written commitments to specific activities and experiences that require Geoffrey's presence to achieve their full satisfaction. She doesn't just say she misses him. She describes particular plans that depend on his participation and can only reach their intended pleasure when he returns home. You watch as she creates curiosity gaps in her correspondence, intriguing mentions of household developments, family news, or local events that she promises to explain more fully when Geoffrey returns. She's essentially making her physical presence necessary for him to satisfy his curiosity about matters that affect his interests and responsibilities. The medieval wife's written expressions of love become increasingly sophisticated forms of psychological conditioning. You observe that Marguerite's letters consistently associate Geoffrey's presence with positive emotions while framing his absences as temporary interruptions of their natural happiness together, programming his subconscious to view separation as an unnatural state that requires correction. The morning's correspondence session concludes with Marguerite sealing her letter with wax impressed with their family crest, but she also includes a small pressed flower from their garden and a few drops of the lavender oil she wears, sensory elements that will trigger memory and desire when Geoffrey receives her message. You realize you've witnessed the transformation of simple letter writing into multimedia psychological warfare, designed to make physical separation feel emotionally unbearable. As she prepares additional small gifts to accompany future letters, a lock of her hair, a piece of fabric from the dress he complimented last month, a miniature drawing of their children, you understand that written correspondence has become her method for projecting domestic presence across any distance, making home feel psychologically inescapable regardless of physical location. You find yourself in the castle's great hall 1 year later, watching as Marguerite surveys her domestic kingdom with the quiet satisfaction of a master strategist whose campaign has achieved complete victory. The morning sun illuminates a scene of profound domestic contentment. Geoffrey consulting with her about estate management decisions, their children seeking his advice on their studies, the household running with the smooth efficiency that comes from unified leadership and shared purpose. You observe the subtle transformation that Marguerite's patient efforts have wrought in Geoffrey himself. The restless energy that once drove him toward external adventures has been rechanneled into domestic projects and family enterprises that provide equal satisfaction with none of the separation anxiety. He speaks enthusiastically about expanding their agricultural operations, improving the children's education, and strengthening their position within the local community, pursuits that require his continued presence and leadership at home. The mainstream historical fact that shapes our understanding of medieval marriage is that successful unions depended primarily on practical considerations like land consolidation, political alliances, and economic cooperation between families. But what you've witnessed reveals something far more sophisticated, the conscious creation of emotional and psychological bonds so intricate and satisfying that practical necessity transforms into genuine preference for domestic life over external adventure. Here's the remarkable truth that modern relationship experts are still discovering. The medieval wife's retention techniques weren't primarily about control or manipulation, but about creating domestic environments so emotionally rewarding and psychologically satisfying that home becomes the most compelling destination available to restless masculine energy. Marguerite succeeded because she made staying home feel like Geoffrey's own choice rather than her imposed requirement. You notice Geoffrey's conversations now revolve around family achievements and household successes with the same enthusiasm he once reserved for military campaigns and hunting expeditions. When neighbouring lords discuss upcoming tournaments or distant business ventures, he responds with polite interest but obvious preference for the engaging projects that await him within his own domain. The medieval wife's ultimate victory lies not in defeating her husband's adventurous instincts, but in redirecting those same energies toward domestic channels that provide equal challenge and greater satisfaction. You watch as Geoffrey approaches estate management with strategic thinking that rivals any military campaign, treats his children's development as his most important legacy project, and views his marriage to Marguerite as his greatest achievement and most valuable partnership. But perhaps most remarkably, you observe that Geoffrey appears genuinely unaware of the sophisticated psychological campaign that shaped his transformation from restless wanderer to devoted family man. Margaret's techniques were so subtle and seemingly natural that he experiences his domestic contentment as spontaneous personal growth rather than the result of deliberate feminine influence. Historians still debate whether medieval marriages that achieved this level of mutual satisfaction represented exceptional cases or reflected widespread feminine strategies that simply weren't documented in official records. But the sophistication of the techniques suggests generations of collaborative female wisdom passed down through informal networks of wives and mothers. You watch the family's morning routine unfold with the harmony of a perfectly tuned instrument, each member playing their role with enthusiasm and skill, contributing to a domestic symphony that provides all participants with deep satisfaction and emotional fulfillment. Geoffrey leads family prayers with genuine devotion, helps plan the children's lessons with engaged interest, and discusses household matters with Marguerite as a trusted partner whose wisdom he values above all other counsel. The medieval wife's legacy extends far beyond individual household success. These techniques evolved and adapted through centuries of feminine innovation, shaping the development of marriage as an institution and influencing our modern understanding of successful partnership. You realize that contemporary relationship advice often rediscovers principles that medieval wives understood intuitively, that lasting love requires conscious effort, that emotional satisfaction must be carefully cultivated, and that successful partnerships depend on making home more appealing than any alternative. As the morning progresses and you observe Geoffrey turning down an invitation to join a neighbouring lord's hunting expedition in favour of overseeing improvements to their family chapel, you understand that Margaret's victory represents something profound about human nature itself. Men may be drawn by the promise of external adventure, but they are ultimately anchored by the reality of domestic love that provides deeper and more lasting satisfaction than any temporary excitement. The afternoon brings visitors who comment on the obvious happiness and prosperity of Geoffrey's household, the evident love between husband and wife, the remarkable contentment that radiates from their domestic life. They live envious of a marriage that appears blessed by unusual harmony and mutual devotion, never suspecting the careful architecture of feminine wisdom that created and maintains such exceptional domestic bliss. As evening approaches and you prepare to leave this medieval world behind, you witness Geoffrey taking Marguerite's hand and expressing gratitude for the life they've built together, the family they've created, the partnership that brings him such profound satisfaction. His words carry the authentic ring of genuine appreciation and love, suggesting that Margarita's greatest achievement was not in trapping an unwilling husband, but in revealing to him the superior pleasures of fully engaged domestic life. The techniques you've observed, from candlelit seduction chambers to strategic storytelling, from carefully orchestrated illnesses to sophisticated gift-giving, represent a comprehensive system of feminine wisdom, designed not to diminish masculine energy, but to channel it toward domestic purposes that ultimately provide greater satisfaction than any external adventure could offer. And now, as the fire burns low in the great hearth, and the castle settles into peaceful evening quiet, you begin to understand that these medieval wives possessed knowledge that transcends historical periods and cultural boundaries. They understood something fundamental about human psychology, about the nature of love and satisfaction, about the art of creating homes so compelling that the people who live within them never want to leave. The candlelight grows dim, the shadows lengthen across ancient stone, and the voices of Margaret and Geoffrey fade into whispered conversations that carry the warmth of deep contentment and mutual devotion. You feel your own breathing slow, your thoughts becoming peaceful, as you realize that the greatest adventures sometimes unfold not in distant lands or dangerous quests, but in the quiet moments when two people choose each other again and again, building something beautiful together that grows more valuable with each passing day. Sleep comes easily now, as soft as medieval silk, as warm as a castle hearth, carrying you into dreams where love conquers wandering hearts, not through force or manipulation, but through the patient creation of domestic magic that transforms houses into homes and marriages into the greatest adventures of all.